This dissertation focuses on an underexplored sector in early modern economic history. It asks, what determined the persistence and expansion of the silk trade between the Ottoman and Safavid empires from 1580 to 1650? From the late 16th to mid-17th century, Iranian raw silk flowed at scale across the Ottoman territory into Western Eurasian markets. This prized luxury commodity linked production zones in northern Iran and Azerbaijan to trading hubs in Anatolia and the Levant, and onward into European demand centers such as Venice and London. For both empires, silk was strategic. For the Safavids, it was the dominant export and a core fiscal instrument. For the Ottomans, silk supported customs revenue, regional manufacturing centers such as Bursa and Istanbul, and integration into overseas markets. Hence, this trade was of high value and structural importance to both imperial economies. Existing literature is rich but fragmented. Historians have described contributing factors to the trade, but have not integrated them into a cross-imperial economic system. By the late 1630s, an overwhelming majority of Iranian raw silk output was oriented towards external markets, highlighting its role as the Safavid treasury's strategic revenue stream. Between 1600 and 1640, English imports of Levantine currants, a principal luxury import from the Ottoman region, roughly quadrupled, whereas English silk imports saw a tenfold increase from around 13,000 kilograms circa 1590 to 130,000 kilograms by the 1630s. These figures tell us that we're looking at a trade that was high value, export dependent, and geographically extensive, yet it moved across a frontier marked by wars, fragmented governance, and political rivalry. The puzzle motivating this research is therefore, how did a high value, long distance trade persist and even expand under overlapping political, institutional, and logistical frictions? Across the broader literature, I identified 4 key determinants that consistently shaped trade outcomes across the period. These are Safavid state-led industrial policies, Julfan-Armenian merchant networks, linguistic and commercial coordination, and logistical transaction costs of overland trade. The Venn diagram conceptually illustrates the factors feeding into my research question at the center. It shows how the various factors interact to influence the silk trade, which this thesis organizes and brings together through the core determinants. This interdisciplinary dissertation will adopt a qualitative, analytical narrative approach, placing historical evidence under a modern economic lens. Each determinant is initially analyzed in isolation to clarify its individual mechanism, and then integrated to reveal how their interaction shaped the Ottoman-Safavid silk trade. I will now present a slide on each determinant, the first being merchant networks. After their forced relocation to the Safavid capital of Isfahan in 1605, the Julfan-Armenian merchants established a new center to conduct trade from. From New Julfa, they operated through dispersed family trading houses operating across multiple markets, as highlighted by Rudy Matthey's map of silk routes. Merchants operated under a commender contract, whereby profits were shared between a stationary provider of capital and a traveling agent that conducted the trade. This structure separated capital ownership from commercial execution, and despite scope for opportunism, the system functioned because transactions were embedded in reputation mechanisms and dense information flows. I will adopt Grief's coordination model for the Maghrebi Traders Coalition to analyze how informal enforcement served these arrangements in the Julfan case. The second determinant concerns communication and informational frictions. Language can be seen as a key infrastructure for this trading relationship. Persian-Turkish bilingualism and comparable commercial terminology, as shown in the constructed table, reduced search costs and bargaining uncertainty across the frontier. This meant merchants could compare prices, hire transport, draft contracts, and negotiate with less costly verification. Julfan merchants also had their own unique Armenian dialect, reinforcing internal cohesion of their network whilst maintaining cross-cultural fluency. This linguistic coordination allowed long-distance trade to be more reliable across volatile frontier conditions, which may partly explain why the Ottoman Silk routes dominated over those connected to Russia or the Persian Gulf. The third determinant presents industrial policy in an early modern context. Under Shah Abbas I, silk became a strategic fiscal sector for the Safavid economy. During the decade of the silk monopoly, the state fixed the purchase price of raw silk and required producers to sell to the crown before resale to merchants. Maffei notes that producers surrendered roughly one-third of the harvest as taxation, allowing the state to convert silk directly into revenue through resale and making the Shah himself the largest merchant in the empire at the time. The upward movement in the composite silk price index coincides with intensified state intervention, which influenced effective supply, with consequences for merchants' costs and incentives. Hence, prices during this period were not purely competitive. The creation of New Julfa in the capital of Isfahan also functioned as an industrial policy by concentrating skilled Armenian merchants into a privileged district, aligning their commercial networks with the Safavid state's strategy to expand and manage the silk export sector. The fourth and final determinant concerns physical and governance frictions. Long-distance overland silk trade depended on hired camels, secured passage, and functioning provincial administration. Ottoman animal requisitioning meant that provincial authorities could temporarily seize camels for military campaigns or state transport needs. Merchants would face sudden shortages and delays, which introduced uncertainty into planned caravans. Logistical disruptions also created hold-up risk, meaning merchants would become vulnerable to opportunistic behavior en route, such as informal levies. Since the caravans were highly asset-specific, being organized around particular animals, routes, and specific towns, merchants couldn't withdraw easily without incurring losses. They would respond by reallocating silk towards corridors where logistical transaction costs were more predictable. To the left, the divergence in silk production between Tokat and Bursa corresponds to the period of the Jalali rebellions, primarily occurring between 1595 and 1610, that destabilized central Anatolia and raised the cost of inland caravan trade. Centers located along interior routes contracted as the labor base and fiscal capacity required to sustain caravan services eroded, whereas manufacturing hubs close to maritime export outlets expanded as they were less affected by fragile inland security. Overall, the economic impacts of this determinant altered the viability of routes for silk merchants. The next phase of this research is to develop a structured analytical narrative for the four determinants, viewing each under modern economic mechanisms. I will then apply Grief's coordination model to the Julfan Commenda contract, analyzing the incentive constraints that made informal enforcement credible across great distance. Next, I will refine the visual evidence, ensuring that data and maps justly illustrate the economic narrative. Finally, I will unify the strands into an analytical framework, addressing a gap in the literature by explaining how the silk trade persisted and expanded under overlapping pressures. This dissertation argues that the Ottoman-Safavid silk trade persisted not despite instability, but through adjustment to institutional and transactional pressures. By identifying and then integrating the key determinants, my research aims to reframe this trade as a coordinated economic system rather than two parallel imperial stories. More broadly, it can contribute to our understanding of how strategic sectors function under great uncertainty, offering insights into how trade can endure and expand when coinciding risks affect all stakeholders. Thank you for listening.